This is a topic called Athens Speakout. Topic is American Foreign Policy Toward the Middle East, Part 3. Today is the 22nd of October, 2017, and this is called Athens Speakout number 411. 3 weeks ago, we reached the point of Jimmy Carter's attempted peace program to mediate the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians after Henry Kissinger's balance of power diplomacy of mediating the Yom Kippur War of October 1972 with President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and the State of Israel. We also pointed out that Gerry Ford's foreign policy was dominated by Henry Kissinger from August 1974, when Nixon resigned, to Jimmy Carter's election in November of 1976. So we're going to go back to some questions of the new news which has happened since those July days. So my first question to Dave is, do you have any recent news about the critics of Donald Trump who believe that the congressional elections of 2018 will bring a big Democratic victory?
Well, the latest is there's been some new polls out, and the polls basically show a Democratic landslide at this point. But it's pretty early in the day to start predicting what might happen in November 2018, I think. I think that so far the chaos of the Trump administration, especially over the last several weeks, is something that might give Democrats hope for 2018. I think that there's a long way to go. There's a long way between now and then, and what happens in the interim is going to be crucial. I think that there's still a lot of healing to be done within the left and between Democrats and liberals and progressives in general. I still see a lot of resentment from the far left progressives over kind of same old business as they see it in the Democratic National Committee, and I think that they don't feel like they're being taken seriously by the Democratic Party establishment. I think that there's going to be some interesting primary questions in 2018 and the primary season in the spring between establishment candidates and more left-leaning candidates and progressive action and activist groups. So as far as it goes right now, yeah, Democrats are winning in the polls, but we're still only in August 2017, and we've got a long way to go. So.
Okay. Well, I'll ask a more searching question. Question 2. Do you have any recent news about President Donald Trump's escalating war in Afghanistan? He made a speech yesterday.
He did make a speech yesterday. And in that speech, he basically, what I saw from that speech is, he said that we're going to send more troops to Afghanistan. Now, this is America's longest running war in history at this point. Going on to 16 years this fall. We're going to be at 16 years. Started in October of 2001. So we're approaching 16 years at this point. We've lost about 2,270-something American soldiers in that war. There's been about 29,000 Afghan and coalition forces killed total. There's been about 31,000 civilians killed total. And then on the other side, as far as Taliban fighters, between 25,000 and 40,000 Taliban fighters have been killed. So what President Trump did, from what I could tell yesterday, is he said that there's going to be a new strategy and he's going to ramp up the war in Afghanistan. What that looks like, he didn't share. He didn't share any details about how many more troops he'll be sending, what they'll be doing, or how long they'll be there. So he didn't really outline any sort of clear strategy for what he wants to accomplish with the more troops. And he didn't outline any clear strategy for, once that's accomplished, how is America going to exit this war? He gave no exit strategy. So I'm with U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown on this one. He put out a statement last night that said, our military men and women and their families have given so much already. Tonight, President Trump is asking even more of them without a plan to transfer power to the Afghan government or a plan to leave the country. He said, a commitment to win is not a clear strategy.
I agree with that 100%.
As we know, the president's fond of saying that he wants to win and we're going to win and we're going to win so much we're going to get sick of winning. But until there are details, that's just empty platitudes as far as I'm concerned. So I don't think that the American people, the American soldiers, the American taxpayer deserves to be caught in this endless quagmire of war with no clear exit strategy. Yeah. And that's what I'd like to see from the Trump administration. I'd like to see an exit strategy. I'd like to see a strategy for turning over power to the Afghan government, turning over responsibility for their country's well-being to the Afghan government, and having that stable environment. I just don't see that right now with what the Trump administration's saying.
Well, you've put this very cautiously. But the United States got out of the Korean War with a stalemate. And the war in Indochina was a presidential declared war, no declaration by the part of Congress. And LBJ and Richard Nixon fought in those long, long wars. And there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Now, you would think that the Republicans would learn something about the unwinnable illegal wars in Indochina. But as soon as the Bush 41 and Bush 43 get in there, they start expanding wars in the Middle East. And we have unwinnable wars in the Middle East with no end in sight. And even Bill Clinton was a poor president as far as I'm concerned, because he intervened in Yugoslavia, didn't give America any new strength, but it did disrupt the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia and broke it up into smaller states. 3 or 4, no, about 8 of them, right? You know, the Hungarians, the Montenegrins, Serbians, and the Balkans are still the Balkans, and there were no victories for the United States there. There was a clear defeat for the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, but we still have Serbs and Croats and Albanians who have their own national agenda. Now, I think economically the Germans gained something out of that war, but America just lost money. So I think that that was not a successful war. So, okay, Trump, I don't think, has a strategy. He doesn't know what a strategy is. He's only a real estate dealer. That's my little sharper conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm sticking my neck out. But,
yeah,
but certainly, Sherrod Brown is right on target.
Yeah, what I saw last night was basically a promise of continual warfare in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. I don't see us getting out of this conflict while the Trump administration is in power. I think that we're guaranteed, basically last night, from what I could tell, he has guaranteed us to be in Afghanistan until 2020 at least. So that's going to bring it to a 19-year war. Almost a 20-year war.
All right. I have no predictions for the future. I go the rule of Bismarck. Nobody can predict the future in politics beyond 3 years.
Well, that's 3 years. I'm in the time frame, 2017 to 2020. I don't see if he's going to ramp up troop levels, he's not, and he's going to make a conditions-based approach, a la George W. Bush versus President Obama's more timeline-based approach in Afghanistan. If it's a conditions-based approach, I think Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson are going to find out very quickly that conditions are not going to get better in Afghanistan. And so if they are committed to keeping U.S. troops there as long as conditions remain in turmoil, to me, that means keeping U.S. troops there endlessly.
Let's get back to Congress. Congress has the power to declare war. Okay, let's look at the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's my solution.
That's true.
Okay, well, let's get back to the Arab-Israeli problem, which is part of the Middle East problem.
Okay.
We finished up the theme of the Arab-Israeli wars, and the fifth Arab-Israeli war to date will continue this series. Now, the Yom Kippur War is also known as the Fifth Arab-Israeli War from the point of view of international relations and diplomatic historians. This conclusion of the Yom Kippur War, or the conclusion of the Yom Kippur War, led to a series of interim agreements which only gradually resulted in an Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire, but no formal treaty. So the election of Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger left the Arab-Israeli wars up to Jimmy Carter to continue to negotiate with Anwar Sadat and the Israeli government. American public opinion assumed that Anwar Sadat began the fifth war by attacking Israel first. On the 17th of May, 1977, Menachem Begin, Likud's party chief, won the legislative seats in the Knesset and became the president of Israel. Menachem Begin was the hard-line Zionist who would not give an inch of territory to Egypt or Syria, and especially nothing to the city of Jerusalem. The Likud has been able to dominate Israeli politics ever since. So Begin, with 33.4% of the vote in the Knesset and 44 seats in the Knesset, became Israel's chief executive. Only 33.4% of the vote is enough to elect the Likud party and Begin as a quasi-permanent presidency for continuing this policy of no negotiations with the Palestinians. When Begin was forced to resign, one of the pseudo-leftist leaders could become the new president of Prime Minister of Israel for a short time. The Likud party remains permanently in office as it is today under Benjamin Netanyahu. All 12 of the so-called opposition parties have agreed on the basics: no land for peace. The new Israeli settlements shall continue as long as the U.S. government will sell or donate advanced weapons technology to the state of Israel. So, on the 19th of November 1977, Egypt's Anwar Sadat publicly broke the deadlock and announced that he would go to Israel and speak to the Knesset, recognizing an Egyptian interim Israeli ceasefire. Egypt's Anwar Sadat talked with Menachem Begin about UN Resolution 242 and a permanent treaty. Jimmy Carter had been elected as president in November 1976. and it would be up to him to pick up the Camp David talks with new negotiations between the Israeli government and the PLO. In addition to Kissinger's ceasefire agreement with Lee Duc-Tho of North Vietnam in January of '73, Nixon's national security advisor was still negotiating to bring an end to the Indo-Chinese wars. The practical effect of the end of the Yom Kippur War was to permanently separate Egypt from the Arab allies, or its Arab allies, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. At this point, we conclude Kissinger's role in starting the process of ending Yom Kippur War with some kind of interim agreement. Kissinger's diplomatic experience was handed over to Jimmy Carter and his new Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. It was up to Carter to get the Israelis and the PLO to talk to one another at the Camp David talks. So, question 3. Do you have any further question about Kissinger's relationship to Israel or Egypt?
I don't have any questions about Kissinger's relationship. What I'd like to touch on, though, is the formation of the neoconservative movement as these things were developing in the 70s.
Right.
So the neoconservative movement, as I understand it, was in large part a reaction to some of the U.S.'s policy.
Whose reaction?
The neoconservatives.
Well, who are the neoconservatives?
They're a very pro-Israel group of conservatives.
Right.
That was formed in the 70s.
Okay, I would say about 80 to 90% are Jewish. Now there are a few Nixon neoconservatives who were Democrats who supported Nixon's continued war. And they argue that the American military-industrial complex is necessary to end the war with the communists. But these weapons can be used later by Israel. So Israel gets the byproduct of this arms escalation. And so that's who the neoconservatives are. They are Israeli, mostly Jews, some conservative Democrats who think that they can make money selling arms to Israel, unlimited purchases of aircraft equipment. So the military-industrial complex, the Boeing aircraft, Senator Scoop Jackson is a perfect example of a neoconservative. He was senator from Washington, and he made money by advocating a hawkish policy on Israel, and you could sell Boeing aircraft as the profits for Seattle. That's who neoconservatives are. Mm-hmm. Many of them, dozens of them. Okay?
So what was their take on Kissinger's negotiations?
Well, Kissinger didn't call himself a neoconservative.
Right.
This was a movement, as you say, among hawkish, some Gentiles, but most Israeli, pro-Israeli, pro-Jewish citizens who wanted to continue supporting Israel with new weapons and continue the settlements. No end. Jimmy Carter, from their point of view, was a disaster for the neoconservatives. Because Jimmy Carter was saying, let's have two-state solution, let's have negotiations.
Yeah, and he was looking for peace.
Yeah, he was looking for peace. So the neoconservatives had nothing to do with Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. But it was just one more example of conservative Jews and some American Jews who support Israel with weapons and war activities. So the wars in the Middle East continue, with the neoconservatives being propaganda for the Israeli lobby. That's the thesis of this book, The Israel Lobby, which we're going to talk about in some detail.
Okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to kind of get Jimmy Carter off the map, because the ball is now in Jimmy Carter's camp now, because when Carter was elected, Kissinger retires and writes his memoirs. But he gives Kissinger gives Carter some advice. You ought to continue balance of power politics. But Jimmy Carter couldn't pull it off with practicality. He was too idealistic, and he had too much faith that he, as an expert on the Bible, would know something about Jewish Americans. Well, Jewish Americans have largely put the Bible behind them, including the Old Testament. Okay, so religion and politics are intertwined. That's what I'm getting at anyway. So anyway, it was quite easy for Jimmy Carter, as governor of Georgia, to defeat the relatively unknown Jerry Ford from Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1976. Jimmy Carter was elected in November because of accumulated crimes of the Nixon administration. President Carter opened up a new chapter in American foreign relations by planning to mediate the promises of a permanent Arab-Israeli peace treaty. Carter pursued long negotiations at Camp David, Maryland, in which Carter moved back and forth between Egypt's Anwar Sadat delegation, who was protecting Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and the Israeli right-wing government of Menachem Begin. The main negotiations were between Prime Minister Menachem Begin's Israeli delegation and the PLO. At the end of these negotiations, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin both received the Nobel Peace Prize for signing a, quote, peace treaty. Menachem Begin, nevertheless, had no intention of enforcing the draft treaty and signed Carter's proposal in bad faith. The Republicans in Congress and the mass media blocked the State Department and Jimmy Carter's peaceful plans. Carter published one of his 23 books justifying his presidency and foreign policy. It was published in 2006, and it was called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. A journalist hostile to Carter quoted this and said, "Carter, you've been called an anti-Semite, a bigot, a plagiarist, and a coward. Do you have any comment?" Carter laughed and denied that he was none of these. Carter quotes honest Israeli sources who also use the word apartheid in criticizing Israel's hardline government. Carter signed inconclusive ceasefire agreement on September of 1979. At the end of those negotiations, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin both received the Nobel Peace Prize for signing some kind of an interim agreement. The Nobel Committee concluded that Jimmy Carter only played a role as a neutral mediator. Indeed, Carter's talks with the PLO and Israel's prime minister led nowhere. At Camp David, Maryland, Yasser Arafat shook the hand of Prime Minister Menachem Begin in September of 1978. But Begin would not agree to make any concessions to the Palestinians on the West Bank and the divided city of Jerusalem. Begin would not give an inch of territory for peace. It was Anwar Sadat of Egypt, in an attempt to save Jimmy Carter's diplomacy, who unilaterally decided that he would visit the Israeli Knesset in Jerusalem and break the deadlock. Anwar Sadat spoke to the Knesset and proclaimed that Egypt was abandoning General Gamal Nasser's Arab socialism and Egypt's previous alliances with Syria and Iraq. Sadat put Egypt's national sovereignty first, and Egypt would agree with Kissinger's formula of a small conventional armed forces all along the Egyptian-Israeli border. Anwar Sadat spoke to Menachem Begin on the 20th of November, 1977, asking one more time for some kind of a concession. Once again, Menachem Begin said no land for peace. So today, the Egyptian-Israeli border is officially open for a minimum amount of trade. Rich Jews go to Egypt for a cheap vacation. Volunteer Muslim terrorists traveling to Egypt dig under the tunnels at the frontier and emerge with small hand-carried missiles in their faith to harass the Israeli citizens with these missiles. The Israeli army, since 1977, quickly represses the unrecognized Muslim terrorists recruited throughout the greater Middle East. So, the birth rate over the long run favors the Palestinians for the eventual two-state solution. Carter became involved with the Iranians in 1979 as a result of the Iranian Revolution. The new Iranian problem sidelined Carter's ambitious peace intentions for Israel. The Ayatollah Khomeini led the Iranian Revolution. Young student revolutionaries set up a Revolutionary Guard to arrest the American diplomats and alleged intelligence agencies in the Iranian capital of Tehran. Since Eisenhower's day, Iran, Britain, and the U.S. were close allies of the Shah of Iran. Henry Kissinger, during the Nixon administration, from 1969 to 1974, to the end of Carter's interregnum, assured the Shah of Iran would continue to be a stable ally of the United States. So Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the neoconservatives, blamed the Soviet Union for secretly aiding Iranian terrorists. So the Soviet Union indeed sent a small group of agents into Afghanistan in order to stop possible CIA agents from infiltrating the no man's land of Afghanistan. According to Soviet thinking, the Soviet intervention in Iran was necessary to keep American CIA agents out of Afghanistan. The Afghan problem backfired on both the United States and the Soviet Union. Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, was dedicated to Carter's original peaceful plans to pursue Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. The unforeseen Iranian Revolution transformed Carter's administration in his last 2 years, 1979-1980, with a new burden of the U.S. hostage problem. Carter, consequently, was defeated for his re-election bid in 1980 by President Ronald Reagan. The mass media in the United States blamed Carter during his re-election campaign as an incompetent foreign policy leader. Carter not only failed to get negotiations with the Palestinians and the Israelis, he did not know very much about the complexity of Iranian politics. Carter was forced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, the NSA, to expand U.S. intervention into Pakistan secretly through the CIA and getting involved in Pakistani and Afghan problems. Carter agreed to a small CIA operation in Iran, still hoping that he could secure the release of the 77 hostages before the 1980 election. Now, during the Reagan administration, American Jews and Israelis tended to lean toward President Ronald Reagan. The Israeli lobby pressured the United States to become involved militarily in order to overthrow the new Islamic Republic in Iran. The Israeli government regarded the Iranian Republic as a new threat to Israel. The revolutionary Iran sent Hezbollah agents to Lebanon to harass Israel, and the Israeli lobby appealed to Reagan as the 40th president to, as he claimed, the military strength for continuing the Cold War against the Soviet Union. American Jews, and even more the Zionists, were becoming more and more conservative and militaristic. In the United States, this new group of neoconservatives, founded during the Nixon administration, published propaganda to send money and arms to the state of Israel. The neoconservatives then, and the Zionists, hoped that Reagan's military policy of procuring and producing more weapons for the United States would eventually become useful to the Israeli government. So when George H.W. Bush 41 was elected president in '88, following Ronald Reagan's retirement, Bush 41 suggested sending a negotiator to mediate with the Israelis for a two-state solution. The neoconservatives continue to grow throughout the American Israel Public Relations Committee, AIPAC. So I'll ask another question. Do you have any further comments about the importance of the neoconservatives?
Well, I'd like to flesh out the Zbigniew Brzezinski role a little bit, because he was a neoconservative,
Right.
but he was in the Carter administration. But then, didn't he continue on into the Reagan administration
That's right.
as well?
Yeah, he switched sides.
So could you kind of go, yeah. So could you kind of go over what was his role in all this?
Okay.
Was he for peace?
No. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a Polish diplomat. His father was born in pre-war Poland, so he's Polish first. Now, Jimmy Carter needed in his council a Catholic official of some significance, because the Democrats can only get elected, ever since Kennedy was elected, in a coalition between Catholics and Protestants and Jews. They have to have the support of the three basic religions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Republican Party have more or less thumbed their nose to the Catholics and say, all right, the Republican Party is all Protestant, Wall Street Journal types, and the military, and a few Catholics like Buckley, William F. Buckley,
Mm-hmm.
supported the Republicans. But by and large, Carter and all Democrats need both Catholics and Protestants and Jews in the three basic religions in order to win the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps or not.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sure.
So anyway, the Israeli hawkish Prime Minister Menachem Begin launched a sixth new Arab-Israeli war. And this was the first war which the Israelis lost In fact, the Israeli government does not recognize any such comment and concept as the Sixth Arab-Israeli War. The Israelis called this war the 1982 Lebanese War. Yet a sixth war began in June of 1982 and lasted until August of 1983, when Begin invaded Syria and Lebanon all the way to Beirut. And Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and his intention was to destroy the PLO led by Yasser Arafat by force. During the war, the Israeli government was exposed for allowing the Lebanese Christian Phalange Party to massacre Lebanese Muslims in a town called Shariba Shatila. The Israelis mobilized 76,000 men in this war. 800 tanks, 634 aircraft, 657 soldiers died. The Israelis lost one aircraft, their tanks were only damaged, and the Syrians mobilized 22,000 troops. The Syrians lost 1,200 lives. They lost 82 to 86 aircraft, and they lost 300 to 350 tanks. The PLO mobilized 15,000 troops and 80 aircraft, and 2,400 were killed, and from 5,000 to 8,000 civilians were killed. The Lebanese lost 368 military lives. The Lebanese and the Syrians lost 12,000 civilian lives. And Ronald Reagan's State Department, led by a Lebanese Christian citizen by the name of Philip Habib, who worked for the Department of State as a mediator, and he worked to bring Menachem Begin's failing war to an end. Philip Habib convinced the Israeli cabinet, including Minister of Defense Menachem Begin, that he would have to go back to Israel. The American government sent destroyers to pick up the weakened army of Yasser Arafat and transfer the PLO to Tunisia. This diplomacy took the PLO forces away from the Israeli border for a few years. When the tempest cooled, Yasser Arafat's PLO returned to the Gaza Strip which was inhabited by the Palestinians. And the Palestinians continued to send terrorists under the tunnels into Egypt. So during this so-called Sixth War, Menachem Begin became depressed when his wife died in September of 1982. In August of 83, Begin resigned as prime minister and died in somewhat of a disgrace in Israel. And Yitzhak Shamir of the Likud party, a right-wing hawkish party, succeeded Begin as the new prime minister. In conclusion, Israel has become less of a democracy and more of a small imperial aggressive state since Moshe Dayan's imperial land conquests in the Six-Day War back in 1967. Yitzhak Shamir, as accession to the prime ministership, continues the dominance of the conservative Likud party. From the point of view of American liberals in the United States, both Christians and Jews, the Israelis' many so-called governments or cabinets become less and less democratic since 1967. Surprisingly, Ronald Reagan's conservative Secretary of State, George Shultz, and his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, were able to put protection of America's oil supply as the #1 American interest in the Middle East, and at the same time, through the clever diplomacy of Reagan's administration, put some pressure on the Israelis to withdraw Menachem Begin during his war, which I call the Sixth War, but officially it's called the First Lebanese War in Israel.
I think this is a good time for a station break.
Good. Thank you.
So
This is called Athens Speakout. My friend Dave DeWitt is a journalist from the Athens News. I am a retired historian and judge politics from the lens of historical precedent. And it is unfortunate that too many Democrats and most Republicans do not read very much history.
no, I think right now we're having an interesting debate about history and
That's right.
where history is properly taught and learned in this country.
Right. So, another review question for Dave DeWitt. Do you have any comments about how Ronald Reagan handled himself?
With regard to Israel?
About this so-called Fifth War, the Lebanese War.
Oh, I see. Well, I think that it's telling that he kept Zbigniew Brzezinski on.
He had to.
And continued with that kind of neoconservative bent.
Okay.
I think that he went even further down that rabbit hole.
So I'm going to introduce here at this point a new book, which I hope we will put on the television screen, called It's called The Israel Lobby and United States Foreign Policy. It is written by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Walt. Mearsheimer and Walt are two political scientists who are critical of Israel's lobby in the United States. This seminal book was published in 2007 during the administration of George W. Bush's long war against Afghanistan and the second war in Iraq spilling over into Syria. John J. Mearsheimer teaches at the University of Chicago and has written 3 or 4 other foreign policy books before publishing The Israel Lobby. The most important of Mearsheimer and Walt's sources are based on books of journalism. This book was basically a work written in historical style. John Mearsheimer came to Ohio University for the historical conference, and I, Robert Whaley, discussed with Mearsheimer's book his first book, called Liddell Hart and the Weight of History, with Professor Mearsheimer. I had done research on the Spanish Civil War, and we both had read Sir Basil Henry Liddell Hart's papers in King's College, London. Liddell Hart was a military historian who wrote about World War I and continued writing for the Times of London during the period Europe between the wars, 1919 to 1939. And John Mearsheimer and I discussed some stories about the German Blitzkrieg. At first, the Israeli lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt had difficult time getting published in the United States. Mearsheimer is a German-American and developed, during the course of his writing of this book, very critical views of the Israel lobby and the State of Israel. Mearsheimer did most of the research for the Israel lobby. The co-author is Stephen M. Walt, also a political scientist from Harvard University, and he has published 3 books of his own called The Origin of Alliances, Revolution and War, and The Taming of American Power, The Global response of U.S. primacy. About these 2 or 3 years before the Israel Lobby was published as a book in 2007, Mearsheimer and Walt submitted a long essay summarizing the content of this book to the London Review of Books. The authors explained how they had tried for many years to get several American publishers to print their essay as a book. In spite of their scholarship, the American publishing industry is largely hires Jewish editors. This is true for editing most books, literary, political, and intellectual magazines. Catholics and Protestants have no problem in owning 100 or more, maybe 1,000 papers from Maine to Florida, from the East Coast to the West Coast. The AP Press Association is basically run by Protestants. This association is owned by many Protestant owners of the majority of America's provincial newspapers. The Chicago Tribune is published by Colonel Robert McCormick, a well-known Protestant press lord. McCormick's family owned the Chicago Tribune when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The family also manufactured the Cyrus McCormick Reaper for harvesting grain. Colonel Robert R. McCormick was the great enemy of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal until he died in April of 1955. In 2017, the family still publishes the Tribune and manufactures the International Truck, but the Tribune has hired a few more liberal journalists by 2007. The Chicago Tribune now has to sell newspapers to black citizens in the city of Chicago. A second leading Protestant press lord is William Randolph Hearst, who owned a chain of newspapers in the 10 top cities of the United States from 1898 to 1948, when television began to erode the Hearst's influence. Both McCormick and Hearst were leaders in the old conservative Republican Party. With the invention of TV, the Hearst newspaper empire began to rapidly decline. So since the 1890s, many young Jews became reporters and editors by 1914. One of the leading intellectuals, for example, is Walter Lippmann, who started the New Republic in 1914, on the eve of the First World War. The New Republic started out as a socialist magazine. In the period of my lifetime, from the 1930s to the death of Walter Lippmann, he wrote a syndicated column for the New York Herald Tribune, a liberal Republican paper. Lippmann had gradually become more conservative in the 1930s through World War II and up to the point of his death in December 1974, just before President Richard Nixon resigned. As a Jew, Lippmann was born and died in New York City. Looking at the table of contents of the Mearsheimer and Walt book, Israel Lobby, their chapters are divided into part 1, which contains 6 chapters. Chapter 1, The Great Benefactor. Here is the text explains that American mass media industry and the rich Jews have sent money to the state of Israel since 1945-48. Jewish money and Jewish editorial talent leads to the growth of the Israel Lobby. The lobby became important inside the American Democratic Party. Chapter 3 is called A Dwindling Moral Case. The text elaborates how, since the Six-Day War in 1967, more and more Jews and Gentiles in the United States perceive that the Zionist state is becoming less democratic and more imperial, relative to the occupied Palestinians on the West Bank. Part 2 of the Israel lobby is called The Lobby in Action. Chapter 9 says, taking aim at Syria. The text of this chapter ties into George W. Bush's war in Iraq, beginning in March of 2003, which is still going on. George Bush 43's military occupation forces began to intervene into the politics of the state of Syria through CIA agents. It was the Israeli government which put forth the case that Syria was a threat to the state of Israel. The Israelis were afraid of 3 terrorist groups, the Hezbollah, the Hamas, and the Islamic Jihad, for being subsidized by President Bashar al-Assad of Syria and the Iranian Republic. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, pressured Congress to pass anti-Syrian resolution by an overwhelming majority, 398 to 4 in the House of Representatives and 89 to 4 in the Senate on the 12th of December 2003. Bush signed the resolution into law the same day, and soon thereafter President Bush 43 withdrew the American diplomatic representative from Damascus. The Israeli ambassador to the United States called for regime change in both Iran and Syria. Haaretz published this, and this was quoted by Mearsheimer and Walt. Regime change became a second bite, sound bite, for the old concept of the coup d'etat. The Israeli government was calling for the United States to launch 2 preventative wars against both Syria and Iran. As soon as the United States attacks either Iran or Syria, the American military intervention expands to a new unresolved Middle East war, a new presidential war. The Israeli government in 2003 was advocating that the United States military should send military units to both Syria and Iran to prevent Iran and Syria from threatening Israel. Only the naive, both Christians and American Jews, continue to believe in the Zionist propaganda. In the long run, AIPAC continues to use many propagandists in the United States to raise money and arms for the Israeli government since its foundation. The executive director of AIPAC, which was founded in 1959, made contact with key legislators behind many mass media's public relations group. The first director was I.L. Kinnan. AIPAC played a larger role in the Six-Day War in 1967. In 1973, it had a budget of $300,000 a year, and it was increased to $40 and $60 million by 2007. So in 1977, with the election of the Likud party in Israel, the lobby moved again to the right. And AIPAC in 1995 sponsored a resolution in Congress to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem over the objections of the UN and the State Department. AIPAC was a coalition of many previous Jewish organizations: the Anti-Defamation League, the Zionist Organization in America, followed by dozens of smaller, decentralized committees with freedom and democracy in their titles. American Jews created in the 1970s a new Arab American organization called neoconservatives. The neoconservatives were mostly Jews who wanted to increase the military appropriations, and the old conservatives were mostly Protestants and Catholics, including the famous FBI director J. Edgar Hoover from 1924 to his death in 1972. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan were Republicans and old conservatives. During the Reagan administration, AIPAC in 1984 published a college guide exposing the anti-Israeli campaign on campus. We'll have to stop at 2 minutes, and we'll have to continue the Ronald Reagan's relationship with the Jews next time. This is called Speakout. This is called Democracy. Debate is the oxygen of democracy, and we have to keep this debate going.
And we will keep it going.
Would you like a couple of minutes for your summary?
Well, I think it's interesting what you have to say there about AIPAC and as it relates to the other organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League and their roles in what Mearsheimer calls the Israel lobby. Yeah. I'm looking forward to learning more about it when we join each other again next week.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Professor.